Should I get started or give it a few minutes?
You'll give it a few minutes. Attendees are just beginning to join. We have 3 attendees so far.
Okay, good evening, everyone. We're just going to give folks another minute or so to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get started. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for a conversation on career advancement with Vijay Sandal. I'm Priya Bhattija, Vice President of Professional Development for SABA North America. And over the past few years, SABA has made a commitment to providing members with additional programming on professional development, programs like the one that we're going to have tonight. We've also have our SABA Leadership Institute, and if any of you who are joining have 10 to 15 years of experience and are interested in a leadership development program made for you as a South Asian attorney, please consider applying for that program. The deadline is tomorrow, but the application is pretty simple to complete. In addition to programming like this, as well as the SABA Leadership Institute, we also provide educational activities around wellness, and we also provide help and assistance as chapters across the country take on service activities, because that is a unique part of professional development as well. So today I'm really excited to have Vijay join us for this conversation, and I don't want to take time from that conversation, so I am going to turn it over now to Krithika Rajkumar, who is the SABA Vice President of the Young Leaders Division. She's also a litigation associate at Holland and Knight. And then Vijay Sandal, who's director at Sterling Clark Group. He's an experienced legal recruiter who understands the hiring needs of attorneys, firms, and companies. He has placed attorneys in legal roles for AmLaw 100, mid-size and boutique law firms, Fortune 100 and 150, and startup companies. So Krithika and Vijay, thank you so much for having this conversation today, and I will just turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Priya, for that introduction. And thank you so much, Vijay, for being with us today. We're so excited to have you. You have some excellent tips for our SABA members and their job search process. We're going to cover a bunch of areas today, but if you have any questions for our attendees, please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll have some time at the end for some questions. And since the job search process itself is a highly individualistic one, Vijay is going to be giving a more high-level overview of advancing your legal career. So to get a more detailed and tailored advice, I highly encourage you to take up the opportunity to sign up for a complimentary strategy session, which Vijay has kindly offered to our members, and we'll pop a Calendly link in the chat box for you to schedule that session with him. So without any more delay, let's get started, Vijay. So the first question I have for you is, what are the main indicators that you should start looking for new opportunities?
Yeah, no, great question. So first of all, if you're not getting enough hours, that's a big indicator. Also, attrition within your group and also the firm, nationwide, not just in your office. these are all indicators. And then the other main indicator would be you're not getting enough substantive work, especially versus your peers. So those are all gauges to make you think, okay, maybe I need to start looking.
Okay. And when you're looking for that new opportunity, what should you be looking for?
Right, yeah. So this question's unique to each individual, obviously. But two main factors that most people are considering is one, the work. So you should be seeking opportunities that you're not currently receiving. So as an example, for a litigation associate, you may be seeking opportunities to take depositions. Another example, as a corporate associate, you may want the opportunity to run deals. So you could look at firms that work on smaller deals. Another main consideration is pivoting, right? So pivoting is always difficult, but especially with the current economy, which we'll discuss later, it's something that I hesitate to recommend people to do because firms are much more selective in this time where people can plug in and play. So trying to pivot in a practice area without the necessary experience will rarely bear fruit in such a climate. The other main consideration apart from the work is a culture. So things like mentorship, training, is there diversity? And then also when you're interviewing, getting a 360 overview from the potential group by speaking both to partners and associates.
Okay. So as you know, all of our members are of South Asian descent. And so specifically for a South Asian attorney, what are some things that they should look for when they're looking for a new position?
Yeah, definitely. So it goes back again to the diversity question. So you need to find out when you're interviewing or a prospective firm, are there people like yourself in the group you'd like to join? And then secondly, are there people like yourself in positions of leadership within your specific group that you'd like to join and the firm overall? Then you need to ask, are there substantial diversity initiatives in place for where you'd like to go? But again, these questions are aimed at diversity being the driving factor. Diversity is very important, but should be balanced among other factors that are important to you specifically.
So I know you talked a little bit about the economy in the beginning, but how does the current economic climate impact the job search from your perspective right now?
Yeah. So just to give you an indication, like when the pandemic first hit, which I guess would be a time where there's a high level of uncertainty, the people that reached out to me the most were those in in-house positions, from tenured GCs, AGCs to junior in-house counsel. I often get asked the question about being worried about first in, last out. In my experience, this applies more so to the in-house sector rather than law firms. Law firms in general are more conservative in nature, and hiring decisions at the end of the day are business decisions. So to hire someone costs money and time. So if a firm is interviewing you is because it's a well thought out financial decision by the firm. The reason they're hiring is because there's demand by clients that need to be met and ultimately more money to be made. So the main reason if you are to be let go is due to performance, which is in your control rather than tenure. Just to give a bit of context. So to highlight law firms being conservative in their approach, after about an 18-month hiring boom, the legal market is setting an expected course for correction. So job openings are decreasing and firms are becoming increasingly pickier on who they hire. And in these times, diversity actually helps. As firms are more selective, they're still trying to meet their diversity initiatives. Those don't go away. So decisions in hiring someone from a diverse background may take priority if all things being equal.
Okay. So when you're in the job search process, I know people have a lot of different ways in which they approach that. They can self-apply to jobs. They might know somebody who is at a firm and they choose to apply because of that. But you're a recruitment consultant. And so how does somebody know whether to use a recruitment consultant or not?
Yeah, good question. So just to give you some context, roughly 75% of law firms, their hiring comes from recruitment consultants who they trust, right? There's always a recruitment budget in place with these firms, regardless of the economy. And in terms of going out on your own and applying yourself, I recommend if you have a strong personal connection, with a hiring partner or someone like that, then it may be worth your while. But then I often have people come back to me and say, I wish I'd actually used someone like yourself than going through my own connections. The reason being is that when you want to negotiate a compensation package, it's useful to have someone with experience and impartiality to advocate on your behalf, such as a seasoned recruitment consultant, because the last thing you want to come across is mercenary. So firms lean heavily on trusted recruitment consultants to vet candidates. And then furthermore, if you have a well-respected recruiter representing you, your chances actually increase as firms have come to expect a certain caliber of candidate from that recruitment consultant. And so based on the reasons I've just explained, firms rely on seasoned recruiters during leaner times to make sure they make the right choices. One thing that I'm not sure if everyone's aware of is that recruitment consultants are paid by the client and not the candidate. So you should take advantage of a free experience resource. And then just to like bring it into a real world example, you have to ask yourself, when buying a home, do you do it yourself or use a realtor? The same applies when looking for a job.
Yeah, and we have a question in the chat actually, which is kind of going towards the next section of what we're going to be speaking about. But this person wants to know, how do you find a headhunter, or do you select one or more at the same time? So if you can talk about that, and then also talk about, you know, how people can access the right recruitment consultant if that's an avenue that they want to go.
Yeah. So in terms of how to reach out to a recruitment consultant, I would say if you know somebody, and I'm going to discuss like through various ways. So if you have like somebody that comes personally recommended, like one of your friends, one of your peers used a recruiter, they're impressed, that's the way to go. In terms of using one recruiter versus many, one piece of advice that I say to people is you should be careful and conscious who you give your resume to, because there are a lot of recruiters out there who will just send you out without your permission. And then I've had that happen many a time when I'm working with somebody and they say, okay, I'm interested in this firm, and then I send them, that firm comes back to me and says, actually, they've already been sent in by another recruiter. At that point, I can't help, and it looks unprofessional. It makes you look a little bit desperate. So my advice, generally speaking, is if you can help it, I would work with one trusted recruiter who's able to navigate all your processes and coordinate it in a strategic manner, rather than creating more work for yourself by working with various people and actually decreasing your chances of success. So that goes to that question. And then going back to your question, so generally speaking, I'm sure that many attorneys get numerous messages from many recruiters and they're often unsure who to trust. So some factors I would consider when deciding who to choose is, when you receive a message from a recruiter, ask yourself, is it generic and potentially part of a mass mail, or is the opportunity tailored to your experience? Next thing is reviewing the recruiter's LinkedIn page. What's their level of experience? Many new green recruiters tend to reach out. More importantly, do they have recommendations from your peers on their LinkedIn page? We live in a review-based world, and so I think that's really important. And those can often be found at the bottom of someone's LinkedIn profile. Then are they also an attorney, the recruiter that's reached out? If you're working with someone who's also an attorney, chances are they understand your situation a little better. And then, as I mentioned earlier, has a recruiter come personally recommended? Then when you actually speak with a recruiter, you have to kind of gauge how they come across. So are they pushing a role on you, or are they asking you about your needs and motivations? You have to ask yourself, will they provide a tailored solution to meet your needs? Other ways to reach out to recruiters or find out about recommended recruiters is like through the SABA network, speaking to peers. You should use your SABA network by taking advantage of the personal development opportunities, sessions like this one, SLI, and attending conference where you can meet people in person. I know looking for a job can feel isolating as it's a confidential process, so you feel like you don't know who you can confide in. But that's the time to reach out to someone like myself who can advise you confidentially. If needs be, reach out to people you know at other firms rather than your own firm. And just remember this, you're not the only one looking for a new role.
Got it. And so I have another question that goes along with this section, which is, someone asked if you could tell us a little bit about the GC job search, the general counsel job search. So would engaging someone like you help, or is it more about the firm that's engaged? So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sorry, do you want to just repeat the question?
Yeah, so the general counsel job search, would engaging someone like you help if you're going to an in-house position, or is that process completely different?
So the process, from the back end is different. However, using somebody like myself, again, helps for the various reasons I just discussed. So in terms of from the candidate's perspective, the same applies, but in terms of from my perspective of how the process runs, it's different. And what I would say, going back to the economy, is that right now, if I was advising a friend, like an attorney who's like, I want to go in-house, I'd be saying, let's just wait and see what happens with the economy, and then make that move rather than trying to make the move now. Because as I mentioned earlier, most of the people that reached out were people in these tenured positions in-house, and they were being let go left and right. And I feel like within the in-house sector, it's less structured and could be less strategic on the hiring front, and overhiring can often occur. So in a downturn, you just sort of want to pause. And I think that if you are looking to make a move, my suggestion would probably to go to another firm to gauge a different set of skill set, and a different experience, and then make that move to in-house. So that's sort of like to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you. So let's move on to, now that you've decided whether or not you want to use a recruiter or not, you obviously need to get your resume ready. And so when you're looking for a new job, so what tips can you share regarding resumes?
Yeah, of course. So again, this is going to be quite general, but items to prioritize are things like tailoring your resume to the opportunity you're seeking. I know that sounds simple, but you really need to take care when you're thinking what you're putting down on paper. You want to put your substantive work at the top of your resume, and where possible, use acronyms such as like the SEC, DOJ, FTC, if that's what you've worked on. Otherwise, like things like numbers matter. So if you worked on a multi-million dollar or billion-dollar deal, please highlight that. Corporate lawyers should have a deal sheet. Litigation associates should have writing samples. Also, you want to highlight if you're a member of any diverse group. Obviously, that's relevant to this. You want to highlight some personal interest to show your personality. And this misnomer that a resume needs to be one page is definitely not true. So if you're thinking to be super selective and miss out important things, please don't. It doesn't need to be one page.
Yeah, going along with this, someone in the chat actually asked, do you see a general counsel resume looking very different from resumes for other legal positions? If so, how do they look different, or do these same tips sort of apply in the general counsel context?
Yeah, the same tips apply. Obviously, when you're in-house versus at a law firm, you're working on more practical matters. You're, working with one client. You're working on a strategic approach versus servicing many different clients. And so that's what you should consider when you're looking to put together your resume. But essentially, just remember your audience. Your audience tends to be people that have come from law firms themselves. So what they're looking for is some strong, solid law firm experience and sort of what you did at a law firm. And then obviously your in-house experience if you're currently in-house.
I hope that answered your question. Feel free to do a follow-up if needed. Do you have some do nots for your resume?
Yeah, again, general, but what I would say is do not put any roles that are not relevant to your job search, right? You want your resume to be as neutral as possible. So this includes trying to stay away from political affiliations, trying not to highlight any potential controversial activities or interests. And as an example, if let's say you're a mid-level associate, try not to mention experience such as doc review. Mention what you've done most recently. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you want it to be substantive.
Awesome, thank you. So now that you've sort of crafted your resume, and I know specifically in the recruiter context, something that you really like to do is before you submit a candidate to a position, you like them to create sort of a personal narrative. And you've always described it as something that's separate from your resume. You want to make sure that when a recruiter presents you to a firm, that you have a good narrative to present to the firm as to why you're making a move. So can you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So, what people need to realize is that your resume is just part of the process, right? It's then about your story, like what are the motivations and things like that. So I'm going to go into that just to sort of break it down a little bit more. But yeah, the narrative is something that you need to formulate aside from your resume. So factors I would consider is, what does your resume say about you? What is your current situation at work that's leading you to want to make a move? What are those motivations? How would you describe them to a potential employer? And then also, if you have any gaps or anything that you think may be targeted on your resume, like maybe a potential weakness you may feel, like you have to have an explanation ready to go if asked further, because often if there's gaps in resumes, I get asked straight away by the law firms, could you explain a little bit more about that? So there's a lot of things that happen even before you get to the stage of answering these questions in an interview. And obviously, if you work with somebody like myself, I'd go into that in more detail.
Got it. So once you actually get the interview at wherever you're looking, what are some common interview questions that you've faced?
Yeah. So then the main interview questions that you'll be asked from the very beginning will be the two whys. Why are you looking to leave? Why are you looking to join us? Those questions are quite interwoven and there's a lot of overlap there. But essentially, in, let's say, a screener interview, that's going to be the crux of the interview. And then as you progress further, and this could happen in the screener, but typically more so in the next round of interviews, there'd be questions such as, could you describe a time that you disagreed with a partner? What's been your biggest challenge and why? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? And then also you want to have questions for the interviewer, such as what was their career path and why? Everyone loves talking about themselves. And so that's a great way to sort of have somebody talk about themselves and take the pressure off you for a second. And then also of interest to you is, how is the work distributed within the group?
There's a great question in the chat box actually, and it says, ask Vijay, there are COVID-19 breaks sometimes, or unemployment, how to indicate or respond to those questions. Sometimes they want to know why you left the last position and you don't want to share that. So how do you respond and avoid those types of, more delicate situations?
Yeah. And so this is going to sound quite simplistic, but it actually works very well, is that you say you left for personal reasons, right? And, and you could elaborate further and say, maybe it's something to do with family, maybe, something along those lines. But as soon as you say the word personal, they're not going to ask follow-up questions. Like they may do, but it's extremely rare. And so that's one way to sort of get past that and not have follow-up questions. And it's up to you what your comfort level is to describe certain, absences or whatever. What I would say is, given, we're in still the COVID world to a certain degree, but COVID's allowed for those gaps to be much more understanding than before. Because as I mentioned, most law firms are very hesitant and conservative. And so if they see any potential red flags, they just want to have those explained. But I think with COVID, firms and companies have become much more understanding.
Thank you. And I know you work with a lot of different candidates that come from a lot of different backgrounds, but and I'm sure all of them have faced some not so common interview questions as well, other than, having to explain more delicate situations. What else have you heard from your candidates that they've experienced in an interview?
Yeah. So some of the questions that I feel like are less common, but common enough that when I prep a candidate, I go through them, is a question like being asked, teach me something new. So in that case, I would say, like, let's say if a partner asks that question, you're not typically going to be able to teach a seasoned, experienced partner. If you're like a junior associate or mid-level associate, even senior associate, you're not going to really be able to teach them something about the law. So this is where I would lean on your interests. And, the more technical the interest, the better. But this is where they're sort of looking at your personality. Another question is, what's the last book you read, right? So in that instance, you want to pick a book suitable to discuss in an interview. And it doesn't need to be the last book you read, but just, I would say, more on the suitability factor. And then one question that I got very recently that a candidate received was, what do you dislike most about your job? Most about your work rather than your job. So that's obviously a difficult question and can leave people a little bit stunned. And I think the best way to go about answering that is to discuss your current reasons to making the move and relaying it to, this firm that you're interviewing with.
That makes a lot of sense. There is a small follow-up to the previous question that you answered. So I know you said that personal reasons is a great way to sort of talk about some of those more delicate situations for why you may be leaving. And this person was wondering, personal reasons may make them think that you don't want to stay at the new position because maybe you won't be in a position to make a move, or, it's very open-ended, right? So do you have any advice to someone who may think that, them saying personal reasons might give the firm the wrong impression, or do you feel like that has not given the wrong impression?
Yeah, no, that's actually a good follow-up question, because the second part, which I forgot to mention, is so you want to say, and again, it's like gauging your level of comfort here. It's like there isn't one answer that is right for everybody. And, you know, for instance, if this person wants to, you know, speak with me in one of the individual sessions, you know, we can discuss in more detail. But generally, what I would say is yes, like, so I'd stick with the personal situation. However, you then want to follow up with it's being taken care of, right? So essentially, yes, there was a delicate matter, but that's not going to be a distracting factor moving forward. And so I'm glad that person asked that follow-up question. So yeah, I would say personal reasons, with the caveat of it's no longer an issue anymore. It's been handled. It's in the past.
Got it. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. So for anyone who's listening in, please feel free to put more questions in the chat. I'll address them as we go along. All the questions so far have been great, but I have a few more questions for you, Vijay.
Yeah.
So for people that may not have used the recruitment process, it can seem like a little bit daunting. So can you explain sort of how that process works, like from the time someone would use you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I speak with many people, you know, it's their first time about lateraling or making a move to a company from a law firm, and the process can be overwhelming. So it's helpful to have somebody advise you every step of the way. As mentioned earlier, using a recruiter is a free service as we get paid by our clients, so the firms or the companies you join. So, and another thing, recruiters rarely mention this, but just because you're speaking with a recruiter or begin interviewing through them does not mean that you're committing to joining that company or firm. In the end, the choice is yours, whether you join or stay. So don't let fear of commitment discourage you speaking with a recruiter. And then in terms of like the process itself, there's several steps, and just to sort of really simplify it, this includes from submissions to interviews to accepting offers and giving notice. So just to break it down a little bit of what I would do with the candidate. So with my candidates, I put together a streamlined strategy, which includes, first of all, where to apply, and then I handle the submission process. I manage their interview process, which includes organizing the interviews, interview coaching, and interview debriefs. And then we discuss factors to consider when deciding on an offer, negotiating that offer, and then navigating the often awkward process of resigning once you've accepted an offer. You know, a process on average can take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks before you start another firm. So you really need to begin thinking well in advance.
Awesome, thank you. There's a question in the chat. It says, how long should you be at an employer before you consider moving? Should you be worried about appearing to move too frequently?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And, you know, there's many ways to sort of look at this. And, you know, again, it's depending on your individual situation. But typically speaking, you know, firms are looking at, okay, is this person going to be loyal? Is this person going to stick around? We don't want to invest in this person and then they move. So I would say if you've got a couple of firms on your resume and you've been there for a short period of time, let's say a year or less, then yeah, the more that happens, the more questions are going to be asked. Now, if you're an associate that has, you know, just finished law school, working at a firm, realizing that you're not enjoying it, and it's been less than a year, you know, you could also make that move. There's a couple of occasions where I've had that happen, where somebody has gone from one highly reputable firm to another, and only had sort of 6 to 8 months experience under their belt. But again, you know, those are unique situations, and again, can be discussed in more detail. Obviously, like with a lot of these questions, I'm trying to answer them as generally as possible. But yes, like all these situations are unique to the individual. So yeah, you don't want to move around too much, but in the initial period, yeah, there is allowances for that.
Got it, thank you. And for everybody who's attending today, I'm going to pop the Calendly link that I was mentioning in the chat box for everyone. If you're interested in getting sort of more tailored advice from Vijay, feel free to sign up on his calendar to set up some time to speak with him. And there's another question for you in the chat. So it says, you said the employer pays your fees. So if I contact you, you would advise on how to navigate but not get paid until hired. Or are you offering paid consulting separate from the job search? Just a little confused on what contacting Vijay now entails if he is not retained for a search already.
Yeah. So with that, like what I would say is a lot of recruiters say they are on retained searches, and in the recruitment space in general, not just in the legal space, it can often be a line. What I would say in the legal space, it definitely is more of a line than not. Because like I mentioned, law firms are super conservative in nature. And, I've had many discussions with recruiters in the industry. And yes, like if they say they're on a retained basis, again, it could be true, but more often than not, it is unlikely that that is true. And so, yeah, in terms of how the process works, in terms of how like someone like myself is paid, is that yes, I'm not paid until you're hired. So one way to look at that is I would be doing everything possible to ensure you are hired, as long as that's the opportunity you'd like to go to. And yes, on occasion, there are retained searches, but I would just, be a bit skeptical when a recruiter does say that, especially in the legal field.
That makes a lot of sense. I do have another follow-up question for you, specifically regarding, you said you help candidates negotiate their offer packages. Yeah. So what advice could you give our listeners on negotiating compensation packages?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I negotiate them for my candidates, but some considerations to look at is timing. So looking before the end of the year, your chances increase of receiving a sign-on bonus, because they're going to be thinking you're going to get a sign-on bonus from where you're leaving. Versus at the very start of the year, they're going to think, okay, well, that person just collected that sign-on bonus. Why do we need to offer them anything else? But again, with law, there's always exceptions to the rule. And then also it depends on, which practice areas are hot at that time. So just to give you an example, at the start of the pandemic, bankruptcy and restructuring were super hot. And then during the pandemic, as people got more comfortable, corporate and real estate became hot. And so those are considerations. The other things I'd be looking at is I advise my candidates to interview with multiple firms, not tons, but just enough where they're able to make an informed decision about where to go. And then as a byproduct of that, this facilitates receiving multiple offers, which can drive up the offering. And again, as we mentioned a few times, as each process is unique, I'm happy to discuss in more detail in individual sessions, but I hope that gives a flavor of what to be doing when trying to negotiate compensation packages.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned that certain areas of the law were hot at different times of the pandemic. So right now, are you seeing certain types of practice areas that firms are particularly interested in, or certain types of skill sets that people may want to cultivate even in their current jobs to make themselves more marketable to firms if they decide they want to move in maybe 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. I mean, moving in 5 to 10 years, so many things can happen in that period of time. And so it's hard to advise that far ahead. But in terms of like current practice areas, which I see to be gaining traction, are sort of data privacy, more so on the litigation side, securities litigation, restructuring, I guess, unfortunately, to a certain degree, is coming back in demand. Corporate roles are decreasing slightly, as well as real estate. And then always a steady eddy is actually IP, patent litigation, patent prosecution is one that there's always going to be demand for. And then what was your question about the 5 to 10? Oh, so in terms of that, like you want to sort of like, for instance, within litigation, if possible, I would get some antitrust work under your belt because antitrust has been fairly hot with the new administration and the policies regarding that. So that's just an example. And again, it's like just depending on, what your experience is, then we can talk about that in more detail.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A. I'm just going to take a quick look. There we go. So there is one. It says, is it important to work with a recruiter that specializes in a particular geographic area or practice area? That's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good question. And so what I would say to that is, like for my, like just to sort of explain for myself, is that I'm based in LA, But I do a lot of work on the East Coast. A lot of my clients are on the East Coast, and like I would say the main hubs are like obviously the East Coast, which is like New York, Boston, Florida, obviously, with a lot of firms moving in there recently. And then you've got the Midwest, like the Chicago area, and then you've got the Bay Area and LA. And so I work in all those areas often, even though I'm not physically located in that region. And yeah, like I service a lot of different practice areas. But it is useful that, that person has placed in such practice area if you're going to go ahead and work with them. Obviously, that isn't critical, but it's useful.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. One more question. Thanks for all these questions, guys. That's awesome. So can you tell us about some recent in-house placements you have assisted with?
Yeah. So on the in-house side of things, that actually, as I mentioned earlier, has slowed down more so than before the pandemic. But yeah, like I'm not going to sort of in this session mention names on the in-house side of things. But like I mentioned, or Priya mentioned, I placed at the Fortune 150 as well as startup companies as well. And again, the profile of what people are looking for are different. What I would say, maybe this is too much detail, but I think people would be interested in hearing this, is that it used to be the magic number was after 4 years of law firm experience, you go in-house. Now that's actually changed, and it's more so 6 to 8 years that they're looking for. Obviously with in-house, there's a lot of demand, and people are being more selective on who they hire. And so they're looking for people with more experience. Then to caveat that, again, like, we talk with law, there's lots of exceptions, is that if you're looking at startup companies, there may be some more leniency on your level of experience. But again, in this current economy, going to a startup may not be the smartest move, given that there's a lot of uncertainty. And, like I said, many people go in-house and then want to come back. And the thing is with law firms is they don't count the years out. So let's say you're at a company for 4 years, they probably only credit you 2 years in terms of coming back. And so that's the other component where I know with the non-billable component and things like that, the grass always looks greener. But I've had many people say to me, I'm actually working longer hours than I did at a law firm and getting paid substantially less. Obviously, that's not everybody, but I've heard it enough to sort of like have that forewarning about in-house. I know that's always like in-house is what everyone's interested in, but I just want people to sort of like take a little bit of heed on that and, think about it a little bit further.
Yeah, thank you. And whoever asked that or any other people that are interested, obviously Vijay is giving a very, very high level overview because all of these questions have very, very individualistic answers. So, it could vary depending on what part of your job search you're in, how many years out you are, where you're working, what area you're working. So definitely sign up for a session with him so that you can get some of those questions answered before you start looking. One other question that I had for you was, let's say you're looking to pivot practice areas completely. Yeah. You're going from maybe, and I know you said that right now may not be the ideal time to pivot practice areas, but let's say the economy recovers a little bit, things are looking a little bit more normal. How should a candidate prepare to pivot areas? And it doesn't have to be so extreme, like from litigation to corporate. It could just be that they're looking to do a different type of litigation, or they're looking to work with a different type of client. What sort of advice would you have for them?
So rather than speak generally, I'm just going to pick a practice area, which I feel like there is potential overlap. So let's say you're a litigation associate, like you mentioned, and you wanted to get into IP work, right? I would say if you don't have a technical degree, and with all of these things, right, what I want to say is nothing's impossible. Like what I'm saying isn't like, it's this way or that way. It's so black and white. Like, there's a lot of gray areas. And it's tailored to the individual. But let's say you wanted to go and work in IP and you didn't have a technical background, then I'd say you want to look at soft IP, like trademark work, things like that, copyright work. And so like that's an example where you're like, okay, let me try and get more of that under my belt to then make the transition. The other thing is, like, let's say you're a patent litigator and you want to do technology transactions, as an example. So you want to try to work on more corporate side of things, because that's what they're looking for. I would say that, like, when there was peak demand for corporate, there was definitely opportunities for people from a different background to, you know, come in and be a corporate associate, because there's a high level of demand, even with restructuring and bankruptcy, because there's a litigation and transactional component to that. Litigation associates, you know, would have been considered for that who hadn't had experience in bankruptcy and restructuring. So yes, there's always ways and means, but it's becoming increasingly difficult because literally groups just want people to plug and play. And so depending on the time of year, depending on if there's a practice area that's hot, those are some of the considerations. Obviously, I'm speaking more so specifically to practice areas, just so people have a better understanding than just speaking very generally. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It does. Are there any candidates that you can't help, like any categories of lawyers that are out of the scope of the people that typically work with you?
Yeah. So, you know, me being me, I like to help anyone and everyone. But what I will say is I'm not able to work with candidates who are still in law school or who've just graduated, or let's say they have experience, you know, across the pond, not in the US and not barred. That's very difficult to place, and especially people that are still in school or just graduated. That's where the summer associate program, that's where my clients lean heavily on hiring people that way.
That makes a lot of sense. If there are any more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I've run out of my questions. Vijay, if there's anything else that you think you want to highlight for our members, feel free. But I'll wait for a few more minutes in case anybody else has any more questions.
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, if there are more questions, then great. But so far, I feel like, you know, you've asked very thorough questions, and, you know, a lot of the people in the chat have asked very good questions as well. I expect nothing less from the legal field. So, no, I'm happy to answer any more questions if there are any.
All right, I'll wait for like 2 more minutes. Oh yeah, let's see. There is one. Oh yeah, so this is a really good one.
Mhm.
So there might be, you know, some people might be really scared to move because they, you know, because they think it might be a mistake, right? What if I make the right decision? So how do you sort of help your candidates deal with that fear of moving? And let's say you do make a mistake and you do end up in the wrong place and you can't immediately go somewhere else. How do you sort of course correct once you're there?
Yeah. So with these things, right, like you are never, you know, forced to stay anywhere or have to stay somewhere forever. And so when I am working with candidates where they feel like they need to make the move, but they're unsure on, you know, what might be the next best choice in terms of where to go next, is that, you know, I would say to people, and again, it's like, let's say if somebody's made several moves already, then I would say I'd have a different conversation versus somebody who's looking to maybe join their second firm or employer, or third firm or employer, versus somebody that's you know, made several moves in a short space of time. So typically the candidate tends to be somebody that's, you know, looking to make their first lateral move, say, or their first move in-house. Is that I would say that if you are going to make the move, and, you know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but you realize it's a mistake, you should stay there for a minimum of a year. And I think a year in the grand scheme of things isn't the worst in the world, right? We spend so long, you know, going through law school, you know, practicing, et cetera, that, you know, a year in the grand scheme of things isn't the worst thing. And so that's where I would say, okay, if you really don't like it, then I would stick it out for a year. In terms of things that you could do while you're at a place that you don't like, I feel like that's going to be very personalized and hard for me to just answer very generally on that point.
No worries. There are a couple of really, really good questions in the chat as well. I'm just trying to pick one to start off with.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so how can you prepare for a move without having people think you're preparing to leave? And sort of going along with that, there's a similar thing, how to, any risks that you see associated with seeking a new job and how to like sort of conceal that from your supervisor or boss would be helpful.
Yeah. So just go back to the first question again.
So the first question was
first part of it, I guess.
Yeah, the first part of it was, how you can prepare for a move without having people think that you're preparing to leave.
Right. So yeah, and I think this applies to any field, right? And I guess what's drilled into us lawyers is the legal field is very small. You need to be careful sort of what you're doing. And yes, that's true to a certain degree. And so when you are looking, yeah, you unfortunately have to have two sides to you, right? So you're doing your day-to-day job and you can't let it be known that you're looking. I think if you give sort of any indication away that you are, then, you're only putting yourself in troubled waters. And so, all the recruitment process is very confidential. So let's say I present someone like yourself to a firm, they're not then going to say to, another firm or their friends at another firm, Krithika's looking for a job, because if they did that, then they'd just be creating a rod for their own back and people wouldn't want to go and apply for them because it would become known. And so the recruitment process, both from the consultant side as well as the law firm side or company side, is super confidential. However, you kind of have to play the game. And so while you're there, you have to act as if that you're not looking for a job, everything's fine. So that's sort of to answer that question. And then the second part of the question was
the second part was kind of going along with that. You answered some of it, but any risks of seeking a new job and how to avoid your bosses finding out about it, because I know that can be kind of nerve-wracking.
Yeah, so I think going back to one of the points that I mentioned is that, let's say, and this goes back to the isolation point, right, where you want to talk to somebody about your situation and just to see if somebody else is feeling the same way. So if you're nervous about your firm finding out, and I guess, we're talking about associates, people often see each other as competition, but then there's also people that are really close, where I've had instances where candidates don't say anything to anyone in their firm. And then I've had other instances where even while they're going through the interview process, they're telling their friends and colleagues that this is what they're looking to do. Obviously, if you do that, you've got to be pretty sure that you're leaving, right? And so in those instances, I would say, if you're unsure of who to trust, then I would say probably don't speak to someone within your firm. Try and, use SABA as a point of reference. Speak to somebody else at another firm. Even like, it doesn't have to be SABA, it can be, your friends from law school or anything like that, rather than speaking to people at your own firm. But you have to gauge, the comfort level. And again, that's personal. But I think if you're really scared of that, then you shouldn't mention it to anyone at your firm, so it could get back to you. But again, talking to somebody like myself, it's a confidential process. I never mention any candidates' names to each other, unless they leave a recommendation, which obviously they've already made the move and things like that. But while a process is live, you have to sort of keep that confidentiality.
That makes sense. There are like several great questions in here. I'll try to get to all of them. Okay. But so someone wanted to know if you could tell them, what type of reference requests to expect, whether it's like a current employer, former employers, clients, others. When jobs ask for references, what do they expect?
Yeah. Again, it's like it depends on the individual and the level of experience. Let's say you've only worked at one firm, and so you don't want to give references of like your current employer, and so then you want to give references of professors, or let's say you had a job prior to going to law school, then someone from there. If you've worked at, a couple of different firms or places, then you can use a prior firm and use partner reference is always best. Like, you can use an associate reference too, but typically partner references hold the most weight. And so then if you've, worked at two firms, say, then I'd go to the previous firm and ask. There are some firms who sort of ask for like references from your current firm, but those are much more, if those are being requested, you're likely to get an offer, and there's always ways and means around that. We can discuss that in more detail. But that's sort of like how to handle that process. I hope that sort of answers that person's question.
Yeah, no, and I can also vouch for the fact that, when I was interviewing, I definitely gave some, like a mix of partner and associate references, and they definitely emailed me back and said, hey, can you provide a few more partner references?
Right.
They really hold a lot of weight to partner references, so be sure that you have that. So I think that totally makes sense. Another question is, do you provide coaching on creating a personal brand or story? Is that part of the services that you offer as well?
Yeah, so in the context of looking for another role, yes, but if the context is at your current firm, then no, not so much. But yeah, that's part of the narrative. And each person has their own story. And what I always say to my candidates is, tell me, be as candid as possible about your situation, because I want to hear the brutal truth. And then based on what I hear, you and I can put together, like, I kind of call it the party line, but essentially what would be the best thing to say in an interview, thinking from my client's point of view of what they're wanting to hear. So it's essentially not lying, but taking an element of what you feel like you want to share, and then turning it into something that makes more sense and something that the interviewer would like to hear. So it's all about, that's why I say to people, be as honest as possible, and then we can talk about it. And then would be my suggestion. But I always tell people, you can't be fake, you can't sort of lie. You have to talk about things that you actually have a reference point on, because the last thing you want to be is caught up in a lie where you get asked follow-up questions and then you're like, I don't know how to answer it.
Yes. Another question that we have in the box relates to pay range questions. So, and like pay range questions, how many billable hours, those types of questions. When do you ask those, or is there another way to find those types of information out?
Yeah. So like, let's say we're talking about big law. For the most part, all of them follow the lockstep model. So people are very understanding of what the comp ranges are going to be. I'd say less of a range. It's actually, this is the number that you're going to be on. This is what your year-end bonus could look like. But then if you're looking at smaller firms, then yeah, like, you don't want to ask those questions in an interview because it doesn't look good. If you're asking about hours, because I always play devil's advocate with my candidates and say, okay, so let's just like look at it a different way. If you're asking me about hours, I'm going to think, does this person only want to do the minimum hours possible, right? You could actually be meaning totally something different, but you don't know, what your audience is thinking. So you always want to, be as neutral as possible. So those questions, I would say, for once you've got an offer, then you can ask more of those questions. You don't want to ask them during. And then if you're working with a recruiter, often they can know the answer to those questions, or at least find out on your behalf. And so it doesn't affect your, someone mentioned personal brand. I guess it goes to that.
Yes. Another question we have is, do you think it's worthwhile to hire a resume expert to write an appealing resume, or is that not necessary in this process?
Yeah, I would say I've seen quite often where somebody does hire, a professional person to do their resume. I don't know exactly what those type of people are called, or even going back to your law school and speaking to a career counselor. And I just see the resume and I just think, wow, like, that's not the way to go here. I would say legal resumes, more often than not, everyone works on their own resume, they share it with me, and then I can give some feedback. But I would say, lawyers are smart people, and more often than not, they get it right. It's just some tweakings needed. Like one thing that I'd say is just going back to, like, for instance, to put it into a reference point of like the bar exam, right? Like, I think we learned that examiners spend 90 seconds looking at your essays and things like that, right? So in a similar vein, when the partners are looking at your resume, they're not looking at every word. They're scanning for, what school you went to. They're looking at your transcript, what grades you got. Then they're scanning for, like, how I mentioned acronyms, like how I mentioned dollar amounts. Those are things that really make things stand out. And so I would say if you want to hire a professional to do your resume, you can, but I don't think it's necessary in our space because it's quite structured and straightforward of how to do things. And then using somebody like myself, we can talk in more detail of like, maybe let's switch this up, maybe let's take this part out. So to, answer that question in a long-winded way, I don't think it's necessary, but of course, if you wanted to do that, you could.
Yeah, makes sense. Do you have any tips for transitioning into big law, and the type of credentials that you would need to transition to that sector?
So it depends where you're transitioning from, but just generally speaking, big law and even, mid-sized boutiques, like unfortunately, a lot of my clients and the legal profession in general is quite elitist. And so they're looking at names, right? What law school did you go to? Like within big law, you want to sort of be at the top 25 law schools. And then if not, and you're just sort of like just outside that catchment area, did you graduate near the top of your class? So there's a sliding scale involved in that. There's some big law firms that sort of are looking for a 3.5 GPA in order to be considered for them. And so that's sort of like on the academic front. And then in terms of like, again, it's like depends what you're doing, but let's say you're wanting to go from a mid-sized or a boutique firm to going to a big law firm, you want to highlight the substantive experience that you have, because let's say you're a fourth year at a small law firm versus a fourth year at a big law firm. You've probably done things like depots, been second chairs, versus like those in big law haven't been. So that's where those things can be of a benefit. But obviously, without knowing a person's exact situation, I'm trying to answer it as best as possible.
No, that makes sense. This next question is a really relevant one, actually. So with hybrid options and like flex work, when do you ask about working from home, how many days you can work from home? I don't know if you're seeing a trend now for what firms are sort of expecting from candidates when they're interviewing them. And this might, again, be a very generalized answer because it might vary firm to firm. But when do you ask about this, and what should you be prepared to say in an interview if a firm asks you, what are you expecting, how many days you're going to come in?
Right.
Those types of questions.
So I'd answer that last bit of the question first. And like what I do, and this is where like empathy really comes into play, is that I put myself in the shoes of my candidates as if I was interviewing. And so when I'm looking at that, I think, okay, if I answer a question exactly the way I want to answer it, like, and let's say I want to be in the office 2 days a week, I want to be on the office 1 day a week, you don't know what they're thinking, right? So in those instances, you just want to answer in a vague way. Like what I'd say to this question is that you have to look at the big picture here. You'd rather get the offer and turn them down than not get the offer by, asking the questions that you really feel like are burning questions, right? So there's always like, there's time. This is where using a recruiter really comes into play to like all these nuances and things like that. But yeah, generally speaking, if somebody asks you that question, you want to be as open and say, I'm very flexible on that front. And then, once you get an offer, that's when to ask about like, oh, what does the policy look like? And then if you really want to find out during the process, when you're speaking with associates, you can, and we can talk about this in more detail, is like finding ways of like asking the questions, but not directly asking how many days a week are you in the office, and things like that. So that's sort of how I'd go about that, if that sort of answers that question.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. How much are you seeing? This is an interesting question. So how much are you seeing, and this might have to be our last one as we wrap up. So how much are you seeing psychometric or psychological testing in the process these days, and how do you prepare?
Yeah, so I'm really not seeing it. I only very recently heard it from one of my candidates when they were interviewing through, again, like a very close personal connection. And it's the first time I'd heard about that. And so I would say if that is going to happen, it may be more so at companies and law firms, but that's something that really hasn't come to the table. Maybe it's something that could be evolving, but I try and keep my ear close to the ground, and I haven't really heard anything about that. And so to sort of like talk about how to prepare for that, I really don't have too much experience on that front based on what I've seen. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I can't sort of answer that question in a high level of detail, but I'm not really seeing that both in-house or at law firms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, we've come to 8 o'clock, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Vijay, thank you so much for being with us. You've given us a lot of amazing advice, and I really hope that everyone on this call takes advantage of Vijay's sessions if you want to, and share that link with your friends if you know of a friend who may want to use Vijay's services or are interested in making a change. He's a fantastic person to work with, and I hope you all take advantage of that. As Priya mentioned, the SABA Leadership Institute, I'm just making a quick plug for it. That application deadline is coming up, so please apply. It's a worthwhile professional development program that many have benefited from, and we look forward to seeing you in some of our future professional development sessions. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.